At David's wedding, I found my name at the last table with the distant cousins, not family. Well, we had to prioritize, Victoria smiled, her tone sweet but cutting. My stepbrother Alexander sat next to David at the front, discussing his latest investment deal like he owned the place. The sight made my stomach clench. I smoothed my dress, trying to keep my composure. "Thanks for making it so easy," I said quietly and walked out. Only weeks later, they would beg me to come back because I've known for a long time that David isn't proud of me. It's not something he ever said outright. He's too polite for that, but it's there in the way he talks about me. Or more often, the way he doesn't. When people ask about my stepbrother Alexander, David's whole face changes. He lights up, talks about how brilliant Alexander is, how well his startup is doing. There's always some new funding round, some new client acquisition, something impressive to share. His voice carries this pride that I've never heard when he talks about me. When people ask about me, there's hesitation, a polite nod, a vague, "Maya's doing her thing." He doesn't elaborate because in his eyes, there isn't much worth elaborating on. I didn't turn out the way he wanted. I didn't chase the corner office or the six-figure salary. I chose a job that he thinks lacks ambition, lacks real potential. Teaching elementary school. In his mind, I settled for something safe and unremarkable. I live a life that to him seems small and predictable. And because of that, I've been an afterthought for years, pushed to the margins of his attention. The wedding was just confirmation of what I already knew, written out in black and white on that seating chart. I wasn't expecting a big role in the ceremony. I wasn't expecting to be the center of attention, but I also wasn't expecting to be tucked away at the back like I barely registered as family. I stood at the seating chart, my heart pounding as I scanned the names. David and Victoria at the front, obviously. Alexander, his wife, his business partner, and his closest friends at the head table, all positioned next to David like they were the core of the family. Meanwhile, my name was buried at table 14, surrounded by distant cousins I hadn't seen since childhood. People who probably wouldn't even recognize me after all these years. For a moment, I thought there had to be some kind of mistake. I read the list twice, thinking maybe my name was elsewhere too. Then Victoria appeared beside me with that patronizing smile. "Well, we had to prioritize," she said, wine glass in hand, her voice dripping with false sweetness. The kind of tone that made it sound like she wasn't being cruel, just practical. She was simply stating a fact, as if my feelings didn't matter at all. I looked at David, waiting for him to say something, to realize how this must look to his only daughter. But he barely reacted. He was deep in conversation with someone else, completely distracted. When he finally glanced my way, it was casual, indifferent. Like he hadn't even considered the seating arrangement. Like it hadn't crossed his mind that maybe I shouldn't be sitting in the farthest corner of the room. That glance told me everything. That was the moment. Not the seating itself, not Victoria's smirk, but that glance. The casual indifference, the complete lack of recognition that anything might be wrong. Because to him, it wasn't wrong. This was exactly where I belonged in his world. And that's when something inside me finally snapped. I was done trying to earn a place I was never going to get. I smoothed out my dress, let out a slow breath, and nodded calmly. "Thanks for making it so easy," I said, then turned and walked out. I didn't make a scene. I didn't slam doors or raise my voice. I just left, my heels clicking steadily against the pavement as I walked to my car. My hands weren't even shaking, which surprised me. For years, I thought this moment would devastate me, that I'd feel broken, angry, maybe even guilty for leaving. Instead, I just felt relief washing over me like cool water. For once, I didn't have to wonder if I was overreacting or being too sensitive. I didn't have to question whether I should just be grateful to be invited at all. The message was crystal clear. They had shown me exactly where I stood, and for the first time, I believed them completely. I sat in my car for a few minutes, staring out at the parking lot, half expecting my phone to buzz with calls. Maybe David realizing I was gone, maybe Aunt Rachel asking what happened. But it remained silent. They were inside, drinking and celebrating, and no one had even noticed my absence. That's when I started laughing, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. I turned on the engine and drove away, and with every mile that passed, I felt lighter. Like I'd been carrying a heavy weight for years and had finally put it down. The truth is, I'd been preparing for this moment for a long time, even if I didn't realize it. Not consciously, but somewhere in the back of my mind. I always knew it was coming. David and I had been drifting apart for years. Long before Victoria entered the picture, even before Alexander became the son he actually wanted. It started with my career choice. I was a smart kid, always brought home good grades, full of ambition. David assumed I'd go into business, law, or finance. Something that mattered in his world, something that generated serious money. When I told him I wanted to be a teacher, he didn't yell or argue. He just sighed deeply, like I had just announced I was throwing my life away. "You're going to work long hours for terrible pay," he said, shaking his head. "You'll be exhausted all the time, dealing with other people's kids. You're setting yourself up for a lifetime of struggle." I told him I didn't care about the money, that I wanted to make a difference in children's lives. His response cut deep. "You could make a real difference as a business leader or entrepreneur. Why would you choose the lowest option?" That's how he saw teaching. Like I had deliberately chosen something lesser, something beneath my potential. He never supported my decision after that conversation. Never asked about my education courses, my student teaching, or my first job at Roosevelt Elementary. But when Alexander started his tech company, David invested $20,000 in him without hesitation. He talked about Alexander to everyone who would listen. Alexander was building an empire. I was just babysitting kids. It was always like that. The stark contrast in how he treated us. When Alexander needed help, David gave it freely, with enthusiasm. When I needed help, I got lectures about figuring things out myself, about learning independence. So I did exactly that. I worked through college, took on tutoring jobs, covered my own expenses. And still, whenever my career came up, David had something dismissive to say. "Long day with the kids? Well, you picked it. Still living in that tiny apartment? Maybe you should have made better choices. Hope you're okay with summer breaks being your only real vacation time." Each comment felt like a small cut, a reminder that he saw my life as a series of poor decisions. The worst part was I still showed up for him when he needed me. When his stress levels got out of control, I was the one who helped him develop better routines. When he was struggling with work-life balance, I was the one who organized his schedule and taught him relaxation techniques. When Alexander's kids needed tutoring, I was the one who spent hours helping them with homework, completely free of charge. And every single time, he minimized my contributions. "It's not like you're a real counselor," or "you're making too big a deal out of this. I don't need life coaching." When I'd mention the hours I spent helping Alexander's children, he'd brush it off. Well, that's what teachers do anyway. I should have walked away then. But I didn't because I kept thinking he's still my father. That had to count for something. But sitting in that parking lot, staring at my silent phone, I realized something fundamental. It didn't count for anything at all. And for the first time in my life, I was completely okay with that realization. I didn't hear from anyone that night. Not a single text message or missed call. I don't know why I expected anything different. Maybe some damage control from Victoria. Maybe a half-hearted "where did you go?" from David. A message from someone pretending the whole thing was just a misunderstanding. Nothing came. I went home, kicked off my heels, and ordered Chinese takeout. I scrolled through my phone like it was just another ordinary evening. And remarkably, I felt fine. Not angry, not sad, just completely done with all of it. But the next morning, the first message finally came through. "Aunt Rachel, hey, are you okay? People are asking questions." That's how I knew the family had started to notice my absence. I ignored her text. Then came another from my cousin Nathan. "Did something happen at the wedding?" "I saw you leave early." I ignored that one too. Then finally David himself, "We need to talk." No apology. No, "I'm sorry if you felt left out," or acknowledgement of what had happened. Just a demand. "We need to talk." I left it on read and didn't respond. I spent the next few days waiting for the guilt to hit me, for that familiar voice in my head telling me I was being unreasonable. It never came. Instead, I felt increasingly lighter, like I was breathing freely for the first time in years. I went to work, spent extra time with my students, had coffee with friends who actually appreciated my company. I did normal things, and for the first time in years, I wasn't replaying old conversations in my head. No more, "maybe I should have said this instead," or "maybe I'm being too sensitive." Just blessed silence. It was wonderful. Then a week later, Aunt Rachel called me directly. "You need to talk to your father," she said without preamble. I didn't respond, just waited for her to continue. She sighed heavily. "He's in the hospital." I almost laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, but because of course he was. "He's stable," she added quickly, "but he needs help managing his condition." He wants to see you. Not he feels terrible about what happened at the wedding. Just he needs help. I should have seen this coming from a mile away. Turns out David had been ignoring his symptoms for too long. High blood pressure, chronic stress, some complications with his medication routine. Before our falling out, I would have been the one catching these warning signs early. I would have checked in regularly, reminded him about doctor appointments, helped him develop better stress management techniques. Now he was stuck in a hospital bed, and I wasn't answering his calls. Suddenly, my absence mattered. The next few days brought a family-wide crisis. Victoria called repeatedly. I ignored every call. Alexander tried reaching out too. I ignored him as well. Then Aunt Rachel made another attempt. Look, I understand why you're upset about the wedding, she said carefully. I raised an eyebrow, though she couldn't see it through the phone. Do you really? She hesitated. You know how your father is. He doesn't always mean things the way they sound. I let out a long breath. Okay, let's test that theory. Tell me what he actually meant then. Silence stretched between us because she couldn't explain it away. Because he did mean it exactly the way it sounded. Every dismissive comment, every time he made me feel small and unimportant, he meant every word. And now he wanted me back, but only because he needed something from me. I got another text that night from David. I need to talk to you. Not I'm sorry or I messed up. Just I need. The word choice told me everything. I turned off my phone. A week later, he was discharged from the hospital. The problem was he needed ongoing care and lifestyle management, and professional services cost money. Before our estrangement, he had me. I did it all for free, helped him manage stress, organized his routines, even tutored Alexander's kids without charging a dime. Now he had to hire actual professionals, and the cost was adding up quickly. Victoria tried one last desperate attempt to reel me back in. I think we should put the past behind us, she said during a phone call I almost didn't answer. I nearly choked on my coffee. Oh, do you really? Your father is struggling financially. This is a family matter. I let out a short, bitter laugh. Right, family. That's interesting, because just a few weeks ago I was sitting at the cousins' table. The silence on her end was deafening. So which is it? I pressed. Am I family, or am I a distant relative you can ignore until you need free labor? That's not fair, she protested weakly. Neither was your seating chart, I replied, and hung up immediately. I don't know what happened after that conversation. Maybe they found someone cheaper to help. Maybe they figured out their problems on their own. All I know is the calls stopped coming, and I haven't heard from them since. Well, that's not entirely true. They did stop calling for a while. I thought that was the end of it, that they'd finally accept I wasn't coming back just because it was convenient for them. Then Victoria showed up at my school. It was a quiet Friday afternoon. I was in my classroom, grading spelling tests and preparing lessons for the following week. I heard a familiar voice at the main office, speaking in that polite but insistent tone I knew so well. I'm here to see my stepdaughter, Maya. It's urgent. My stomach dropped. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. Victoria. The school secretary was already explaining that personal visits during school hours needed to be scheduled in advance. But Victoria had perfected that pushy yet polite approach that usually got her what she wanted. I walked to the office before she could cause more of a scene. What are you doing here? I asked, crossing my arms defensively. She smiled like we were old friends meeting for lunch. I just wanted to talk. We already did that over the phone, remember? Her smile flickered slightly. This isn't about me. Your father is getting worse. I held up a hand to stop her. No, you don't get to show up at my workplace and use him as emotional leverage. Maya, he's not doing well, she pressed. I let out a short laugh. Yeah, I figured. That's what happens when you ignore your health for years. She sighed dramatically. He's deteriorating. We can't afford the level of care he needs. Then you should have prioritized better, I said, echoing her own words from the wedding. Her eyes flickered with recognition. She knew exactly what I was referencing. This isn't the time for grudges, she tried again. He's your father. I stared at her, saying nothing because there was nothing left to say. She wanted me to feel guilty, to suddenly remember my place and step back into my old role like nothing had happened. But I wasn't that person anymore. That version of myself had died in the parking lot outside the wedding venue. If he needs care, hire someone qualified, I said firmly. If you can't afford it, ask Alexander. He's the successful entrepreneur, right? The one who deserves to sit at the head table? Her jaw tightened with frustration. He's too busy with his company. I almost laughed again. Yeah, I figured that too. I turned to leave, but she grabbed my wrist. You owe him, she hissed, her voice low so the office staff couldn't hear. And there it was, the real reason she'd come. I pulled my hand away firmly. No, I don't owe him anything. Then I walked back to my classroom, leaving her standing there. I thought that confrontation would be the end of it. It wasn't. A week later, David called me directly. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. Hey, he said after a moment of silence. I leaned against my kitchen counter. What do you want, David? He exhaled heavily. Victoria said she talked to you. She did. More silence, then I think we should meet in person. I actually laughed out loud. Oh, now you want to see me? He ignored my sarcasm. Come by the house. We'll have dinner, just the two of us. I glanced at the clock on my wall. You know, if you'd asked me that a year ago, I would have been thrilled. More uncomfortable silence, but we both know this isn't about having a nice dinner together. He sighed. Just come by, Maya, please. Against every instinct telling me not to, I agreed. The next evening, I drove to the house where I'd grown up. It felt strange being back. Nothing had physically changed, but it didn't feel like home anymore. It hadn't felt like home for a long time. David was already sitting at the dining table when I arrived. The smell of takeout filled the room. He hadn't cooked, but then again, he never did. I sat across from him, and for several minutes we ate in uncomfortable silence. Finally, he spoke. So how's the teaching going? I almost laughed at the irony. Since when do you care about my job, David? He winced slightly. That's not true. Really? Because last time we discussed it, you thought it was a waste of my potential. He rubbed his temples. Look, I didn't ask you here to rehash old arguments. Then why am I here? He hesitated, then finally got to the point. I need your help. There it was, exactly what I'd expected. I put my fork down deliberately. You mean you need free tutoring services? I wouldn't phrase it like that. How would you phrase it then? He shifted uncomfortably. I thought since you're good with managing routines and helping kids learn, maybe you could help me develop better habits. Save us some money on professional services. He paused, then added, Why are you making this so difficult? I blinked slowly. You know what's funny? That's exactly what I used to wonder. Every time I helped you, every time I tutored Alexander's kids for free, every time I organized your life when no one else would, and you still treated me like my career was worthless. His expression tightened defensively. That's not fair, Maya. No, I said, gesturing around the room. What's not fair is spending years being dismissed and undervalued, then suddenly being needed when it's convenient. Where was this concern when Victoria seated me with distant relatives? Where was this father-daughter relationship when you let her treat me like an outsider? He remained silent because he had no answer. I shook my head. You don't want a daughter, David. You want free educational services. That's not true. Then tell me. I leaned forward. What do you actually want from me as a person? Not as someone who can solve your problems, but as your daughter. He opened his mouth, then closed it because he genuinely didn't have an answer. That was the last time I ever saw him. He sent a few more texts over the following days. I ignored everyone. Then the messages stopped coming entirely. A few months later, I heard through Aunt Rachel that he'd finally hired professional help. A life coach and a tutor for stress management. And unsurprisingly, he could barely afford their rates. Alexander didn't offer to help with the costs. Victoria complained constantly about the expense but refused to take on the caregiving responsibilities herself. And me? I was exactly where I wanted to be. In my own life, building something meaningful. 1 year later, I received a text from an unknown number. It was brief. David's back in the hospital. Thought you should know. I stared at the message for a long time, then blocked the number without responding. 2 years passed. I rarely thought about David anymore, not in any real way. Occasionally, I'd hear updates through family members. His health was declining, money was tight, Victoria was stressed about their situation. But none of it was my concern anymore. And I was more than fine with that. Actually, I was thriving. Without the constant stress of trying to prove my worth to people who would never value me, my life became significantly easier. My job was still challenging, my days were still long, but I genuinely loved my life. I had formed real friendships with people who appreciated me for who I was. I traveled during school breaks, started saving money for things that mattered to me. Meanwhile, David was living with exactly what he had chosen. A wife who stayed only because she had nowhere better to go, and a stepson too busy with his investments to return phone calls. I didn't realize how bad David's situation had become until Nathan reached out to me. I know you probably don't want to hear this, but it's really bad, he texted. Nathan and I had never been particularly close, but he'd always been observant about family dynamics. I debated ignoring his message, then typed back, "What's bad?" "Your dad. He's completely broke. Had to sell the house." I stared at my phone in disbelief. That house represented everything to him. It was his pride and joy. "Where is he living now?" I asked. "Some small rental apartment?" "He's been asking everyone in the family for money." I exhaled slowly. Even now, there was no apology, no acknowledgement of his mistakes. Just another attempt to extract something from people. "Let me guess," I typed. "Victoria told you to contact me." "Actually, yes," Nathan admitted. She did. Of course she had. 2 days later, Victoria called me again. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail. "I know you're still angry, but we really need to discuss this situation." "No, we didn't." I deleted the message immediately. A month later, I received another text from an unknown number. "David's hospitalized again. Thought you should know." I stared at the screen, feeling absolutely nothing. I blocked that number too. 3 months later, I ran into Alexander at a coffee shop downtown. I was waiting in line when I spotted him expensive suit, designer watch, radiating the kind of confidence that comes from never having struggled for anything. He noticed me before I could turn away. "Well, look who it is," he said with that charming grin. "Maya, right?" I gave him a polite nod. "Alexander." His eyes flicked to my casual weekend clothes. "Still doing the teaching thing, huh?" I exhaled through my nose. "Still avoiding David's calls?" The grin disappeared instantly. "What do you expect me to do?" he said after a pause. "He created this mess himself." I tilted my head slightly. "He gave you everything you needed to succeed. And now you can't spare anything to help him." Alexander scoffed. "You didn't help him either." "True," I said, "but I had good reasons. He treated me like my life's work was worthless." "What's your excuse?" Alexander didn't respond because he knew he didn't have a legitimate one. 6 months later, Nathan informed me that David had been moved to a nursing facility. Not a good one either, the kind that barely met basic standards but was all he could afford. "Alexander really won't contribute anything?" I asked. "Nothing. Won't even visit," Nathan confirmed. I nodded. That sounded exactly right. For a moment, I considered visiting David once, just to see how he was doing, whether he'd changed at all. But I didn't, because I knew exactly how it would go. He wouldn't apologize or acknowledge the damage he'd caused. He would simply expect me to fix his problems and resume my old role as the daughter who existed to serve his needs. I wasn't doing that ever again. A year later, I was in the teacher's lounge when the local news came on. There was a business segment featuring Alexander's latest company. He was being interviewed in some sleek office, discussing expansion plans and investment opportunities. I watched this millionaire entrepreneur talking about his success while his stepfather sat in a substandard nursing facility. The irony wasn't lost on me. David had chosen Alexander, had prioritized him, had invested in him emotionally and financially. And now he was alone, struggling, while Alexander thrived and I had built my own fulfilling life. That's when it hit me I hadn't just survived his rejection. I had won. Not in a petty, vengeful way, but in the deepest possible sense. I had created something meaningful for myself, a life that was authentically mine. David had built his own future too, based on favoritism and dismissing what didn't fit his narrow definition of success. Now he was living with the consequences of those choices. It wasn't revenge or karma. It was simply the natural result of what he had created. I received one last text from Nathan. "David passed away last night. Thought you should know." I stared at the message for a long time. I didn't cry, but I didn't feel relief either. I just felt nothing. And somehow that told me everything I needed to know about our relationship. I typed back, "Thanks for letting me know." Then I put my phone down and prepared for the next school day. Because unlike David, I still had people who truly needed me, 28 third graders who looked forward to seeing me every morning.